True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Kathleen Folbigg has lived a life that's filled with tragedy. As a child, her father murdered her mother, leaving her to grow up in foster care. But Kathleen seemed to have overcome her difficult past when she married her husband Craig, and they set out to start a family. But then in 1989, Kathleen's infant son, Caleb, died. This death was followed by the deaths of 3 more of her children in 1991, 1993, and 1999. It wasn't until the death of her daughter Laura in 1999 when family, friends, and the authorities became suspicious. Kathleen denied killing her babies, but her behavior and her journals may have told a really different story. Join us at the quiet end for The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, the Kathleen Folbigg Story. When a mother loses a child, sympathy is abundant. But when each of Kathleen's children died in her care, one after another, dark questions about Kathleen and the complexities of motherhood came up. The accepted wisdom at the time was that 1 cot death is a tragedy, 2 are suspicious, and 3 is murder, until proven otherwise. This left Kathleen and her supporters in the impossible position of proving a negative. Today we're going to go into the medical and genetic explanations investigated to explain the sudden deaths of the Folbigg babies, as well as the psychological and behavioral characteristics pointing to Kathleen as a calculated serial baby killer. Very intense episode today.
It certainly is. Now we've got a nice Australian beer to review. It's called India Red Ale from Prancing Pony Brewery. Now, this is described variously as an amber ale or as a red IPA or an imperial red, whatever. It's 7.4% alcohol by volume. That's a very nice beer. Cloudy reddish-brown color, small beige head, nice aroma, lemon, floral hops, and some caramel. And the taste follows the nose quite well. Lemon, some floral hops, all standing over a caramel base.
That just sounds delightful.
Well, it is. It's very nice. It's reminiscent of the one we had at La Cumbre, which we've discussed previously.
Yes, that's in Albuquerque.
Yes.
Very good.
And we've discussed the consequences of Jill drinking more than she might have needed of that particular beer. But it's the same category. Good beer.
All right. Why don't we open it up and share it? All right, over here at the quiet end, and I'm ready. You start us out.
Okay, why don't we start out with Kathleen's father, Thomas John Britton. This guy was raised in a working-class household in Wales, and he was one of 10 children. From an early age, he had a reputation for getting into fights and for drinking too much. Now, he also considered himself a real ladies' man. Now, it's a good combination to be a ladies' man who gets into fights and drinks too much. Somehow, I don't think they all go together.
I think that he found some trouble in his life, yes.
Now, Britton did lose his job at a cement plant because he grabbed a coworker by the throat. And in another job, he struck a blacksmith in the face with a 7-pound hammer.
Holy cow, that could have killed him.
Could have. He's a real tough guy, and he actually earned extra money as a hitman and a debt collector for some notorious underworld criminals. So when people didn't pay, Britton was okay with breaking a leg or busting some kneecaps. Nice enforcer.
Yeah, so now we know where he was coming from. When he first moved to Sydney, he married Margaret Cope, a pretty, smart woman who was working as a nurse. They lived in Western Sydney and had 1 child, a son who would be Kathleen Folbigg's half-brother. Then in 1952, Britton slashed Margaret's throat with a kitchen knife. She actually survived, and Britton served just 8 months in jail on a charge of inflicting grievous bodily harm. Now, to me, that seems like he should have had more time in jail and maybe been charged with attempted murder. But we've looked at cases in Australia before, and there seems to be less punishment given than there is over here in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that's been my observation. I don't know how true that is, but it does seem that.
So after he got out of jail, Britton fathered many more children with several women, and then he seduced Kathleen's mother. And her name was also Kathleen Donovan. After just 3 years together in late 1968, Kathleen Donovan walked out on him and left him with their baby daughter, Kathleen. So she was a gambler and a heavy drinker, and she had abandoned a previous husband with their daughter and son. So she was just as messed up as he was, really.
It sounds like we had two kind of marginal people.
Yeah.
Britton suspected that Kathleen was cheating on him. After she left, she had gone to stay with friends. Now, her friends suggested that she run away and disappear. But Kathleen didn't want that. She wanted to get her daughter back with her. So she opened a bank account, and she started to make plans for her and her daughter Kathleen's future. Unfortunately, she made just one deposit before she died.
And she died of murder.
She did. Britton tracked his wife down and begged her to come back to him and Kathleen, and she refused, saying she didn't want to have anything to do with him. But Britton, he was an obsessed guy. A few days later, he was riding on the bus when he saw her walking down the street. So he jumped off the bus, ran up to her, and he's begging her, please, please, please come home. So she again refused. Then he started an argument about the money she had spent on her gambling habit. So Kathleen ran into a butcher's shop to get away from him. Britton followed her inside and punched her in the face. But no charges were filed for this assault.
No. Then on the night of December 8th, 1968, after drinking from 12 to 14 pints of beer, Britton waited outside the house where Kathleen Donovan was staying. When she came home, he stabbed Kathleen 24 times with a 25-centimeter long knife. So she bled out in the street. A witness called the police, and Britton said to the witness, "I had to kill her because she'd kill my child. I'm sorry I had to do it." So he was tried and found guilty of murdering Kathleen Donovan. On May 26, 1969, he was sentenced to life in prison. He served 14 years in prison and was then deported back to Wales. His daughter Kathleen didn't know where her father was until his family was located by an Australian newspaper. By then, Britton was already deceased, and he died from some chronic health issues. Didn't take good care of himself. So Kathleen had been a teenager when she found and met her mother's brother. He was the one who told her that her father had killed her mother. As an adult, she found 2 half-sisters in Queensland and 2 aunts, one in Queensland and one in Windsor. So she contacted them. She met an uncle who had cared for her for a while before she was put into an orphanage, and then she ended up in a foster home. Then he told her more about her biological parents and their dysfunctional relationship.
Now, Kathleen met Craig Folbigg when she was in her late teens. She had left high school at the age of 15 to work at a local gas station. Now, when she met Craig, she was working as a waitress. So Craig was 6 years older than Kathleen, and his joy in life was to work on cars. Now, the first time he saw Kathleen, he thought she was really attractive. They dated for several months, and then in January 1986, they moved in together. So then they got engaged that August, and they bought a small house. People who knew Craig and the couple felt that Craig was so in love with Kathleen that he didn't see her flaws. Apparently there were a few.
Yes, apparently.
In August of 1987, they got married. And in May of 1988, the Folbiggs were thrilled to find out that Kathleen was pregnant. Their first child, Caleb, was born on February 1st, 1989. Kathleen had a long, difficult labor that lasted over 18 hours, and Caleb was ultimately delivered with forceps. But he was a healthy kid. His APGAR score, that's the system that checks the baby's heartbeat, breathing, muscle tone, reflexes, and color, at 1 minute and 5 minutes after birth. He had good APGARs. Because she had some difficulties with her own recovery, it took Kathleen about a month to feel back to normal. Well, probably. I mean, geez, they did a forceps delivery.
Yeah, I'm sure there was some damage there.
She pushed for almost 24 hours. That's a tough labor.
Well, the labor lasted that long. I don't think she pushed that long.
I hope not.
No. But, Craig was really thrilled. He felt like Kathleen was happy to be a mom, although she didn't want to breastfeed Caleb because that was uncomfortable, but, that's okay. The nurses did explain the benefits of breastfeeding to her, and she did make some efforts to get Caleb to breastfeed. But Caleb had trouble breathing through his nose, and this made feeding difficult because he'd latch and feed, but then he'd have to pull away to take breaths. So because of this feeding problem, Kathleen took Caleb to see a pediatrician at the Royal Newcastle Hospital, and this was Dr. Barry Springthorpe. She wanted to know if there was anything she could do to make things easier for him.
So Dr. Springthorpe had put together a child development unit in Newcastle. This was in 1976, and this was to look at child development problems, sudden infant death syndrome, and child abuse. Springthorpe had founded a group called the Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect Group, SCAN, and that was designed to investigate child abuse. Putting all of his experience to use, he routinely examined each of his patients for any signs of abuse. Now, when he looked at 2-week-old Caleb in mid-February, he found absolutely no signs of abuse. Springthorpe's examination did find one thing. He found some mild stridor. Stridor is kind of a sinking into the chest when breathing, at least breathing in. He thought this was due to laryngomalacia, which is basically a floppy larynx. Some children, some infants, have softer than average cartilage, and this can collapse on inspiration or breathing in. Now, he asked Kathleen if the breathing problem interfered with his feeding or sleeping, which she said it didn't.
But it kind of did.
It kind of did because he had to take frequent breaks.
Yeah, but she didn't really want to breastfeed anyway, so.
Yeah, well, but he was thriving.
Yeah, he was.
So, and typically, you can outgrow this. Before Kathleen left Springthorpe's office, he reassured her that the condition would improve over time. And by the first birthday, most babies don't have the problem anymore.
So Caleb slept in a bassinet in the bedroom next to Kathleen and Craig's room. Kathleen slept on the side nearest to the door because she was the one who got up in the night for feedings. Craig was apparently a very sound sleeper who didn't wake up when Caleb cried. On February 20th, Caleb woke Kathleen at about 1 a.m., and she said she fed him, burped him, and he fell asleep in her arms. Then she put him back in his bassinet and returned to her bed. Kathleen fell back to sleep, but she woke up a bit later and decided to check that everything was okay, she said, even though Caleb wasn't crying. Craig and Kathleen's statements, though, about what happened after that would be quite different. Craig thought they had the bedside light on, but Kathleen believed it was just some street lights streaming into the room because the house was close to the road. She said she walked to the entrance of the baby's room, but she didn't hear him breathing. She placed her hand on Caleb's chest and didn't feel it rise. So she turned on the light and rushed over to check him. He was still warm, but his lips were blue and he wasn't breathing. So Kathleen picked up the baby and screamed for Craig. But Craig remembered being woken by Kathleen's screams and jumping out of bed to find her standing at the side of Caleb's bassinet, and she was screaming, "My baby, there's something wrong with my baby." So unlike Kathleen's version, Craig remembered that Caleb was still in the bassinet wrapped in a blanket when he came in. Picking him up out of the bassinet, Craig felt that his skin was warm, but he saw that his lips were blue and his eyes were closed. He put Caleb's face up to his ear, but couldn't hear him breathing either. Attempting to do what he knew about CPR, which wasn't a lot, he screamed at Kathleen to call for the ambulance. Kathleen remembered being able to hear the sirens almost as soon as she hung up the phone from her emergency call, and Craig was desperately trying to save his son. He had Caleb on his back and was blowing into his mouth, and he continued doing this until a paramedic arrived and took over for him. The paramedics arrived at the Folbigg home at 2:59 a.m. and found Craig and Kathleen sobbing beside the body of their 19-day-old baby. He was in cardiac arrest, not breathing, no pulse, but he was still warm. They cleared his airway, asking the parents to move aside as they worked to resuscitate him. An oral airway was put into the back of his mouth, and they attempted to revive him using mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and external cardiac massage. Other ambulance workers arrived to help, but it was hopeless. Kathleen and Craig were told their son was dead, and the provisional diagnosis was sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS.
Now, as part of her caring for Caleb, Kathleen had kept a diary for the 19 days of his life. Now, she made entries almost every half hour, kind of obsessive about this, recording his status. Craig saw her use of a diary as a new mother's way of coping and staying organized. The final entry for Caleb's life was at 2 a.m. on Sunday, February 20th, and it read, "Finally asleep!" exclamation point, exclamation point.
Yeah, so that's just about an hour before the ambulance was there.
So later that morning, a police officer from Mayfield arrived at the house. Craig later recalled that he didn't ask them much at all about what had happened, but he had come to express his sympathies. Craig went with the officer to the hospital to formally identify Caleb, but this new father was just completely inconsolable. He had been so happy to be a father. Caleb seemed like such a healthy newborn. He just couldn't grasp all this stuff.
Well, no, I don't blame him.
No.
Kathleen and Craig were introduced later that day to a representative from the SIDS organization who ran a parents' retreat in Charleston. She explained to them that children could die suddenly and unexpectedly when no obvious cause of death was found, and then they just called it SIDS. At this time, which was the late 80s, there wasn't much actually known about SIDS. Craig and Kathleen would have to live with the fact that their son had died suddenly for no known reason. The SIDS rep told them they could try and have another baby and not to worry because this rarely happened twice in one family, almost never. But of course at the time this was little consolation. They'd lost their little boy. But the next day Kathleen called Caleb's pediatrician, Dr. Springthorpe, to tell him that Caleb had died. He contacted Dr. Roy Cummings, who did the post-mortem exam. Dr. Springthorpe was concerned about the baby's larynx and asked Dr. Cummings to check whether there were any cysts or webs on it. Can you explain that to us a little bit?
Well, they're just looking for any malformations of the larynx that could have predisposed him to having obstruction of his breathing and subsequent death. That's what they're looking for.
Right, but there was no evidence found.
Right.
So they concluded that that floppy larynx was not the cause of Caleb's death, and it was officially recorded as sudden infant death syndrome. But Dr. Springthorpe was really concerned for the grieving parents, and he made an appointment to talk with them. Craig was actually very bitter, but he seemed to be coping. As time passed, he continued to mourn in a way that seemed very appropriate, although he was in a lot of pain. But Kathleen didn't show as much grief as one might expect. While Craig felt that he was falling apart, he noticed that Kathleen was basically just getting on with her life. She returned to work at the restaurant she'd worked at before Caleb's birth, and while Craig sat at home and felt this overwhelming sadness, she would go out to friends' houses and even out to nightclubs. In his mind, Craig replayed the time leading up to Caleb's birth and his 19 days of life, and something did kind of bother him. Something was niggling at the back of his brain. It wasn't how Kathleen treated their son, but it was the way Kathleen had seemed to resent not being the center of attention once Caleb was born. So this led Craig to thinking about their nieces and nephews, who they rarely saw, even though they lived nearby. It seemed that Kathleen just didn't enjoy being around babies or young children. In fact, they seemed to kind of irritate her.
And it took a long time for Craig to rejoin life and start participating again in social events, even though Kathleen seemed to be doing that all along. So when they decided that they were ready to have another child, they took the advice of SIDS experts at the time, which was remodeling, insulating the room where the baby would sleep. On June 3rd, 1991, Kathleen gave birth to a son, and they named him Patrick. He looked like Craig, blonde hair, blue eyes. Kathleen's labor and delivery were much easier this time, and there were no complications for mom or baby. Craig was really happy. And Kathleen also seemed delighted with her son. But she continued writing in her diary, and one of her notes was, "This was the day that Patrick Allen David Folbigg was born. I had mixed feelings this day whether or not I was going to cope as a mother, and whether I was going to get stressed out like I did the last time. I often regret Caleb and Patrick only because your life changes so much, and maybe I'm not a person who likes change, but we will see."
So the way she wrote in this diary, it's really hard to know what she was exactly thinking. It suggests some negative things, but we'll read more excerpts as we go, and I'll see what you think about them.
Well, I think there is some ambiguity in there, isn't there?
Absolutely. It's not a confession of anything, not by a long shot.
No, although you could take it that way.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, with this baby, Craig was way more involved. He was so terrified of losing another child that he wanted to do things differently. Because he hadn't spent much time with Caleb, Craig quit his job so that he could stay at home for 3 months with Patrick and Kathleen.
And that's just extraordinary to me.
3 months.
3 months.
Patrick fed well and he slept well. And he was eating every 2 to 3 hours. Now, Patrick didn't sleep where Caleb had slept. He was in a renovated bedroom off the dining room. Kathleen and Craig thought that this room was the safest, protected, and well-insulated, even though it was further away from their bedroom. But they had no problem hearing the baby when he woke. Patrick had none of the breathing problems that Caleb had, and Kathleen seemed happy with how things were going. First couple of months of life, he would wake up around 3 or 4 in the morning, which was the same thing Caleb had done. But by the time he was close to 3 months old, he was only waking up once during the night, and was sleeping soundly from 1 in the morning to 6 in the morning, most days.
So while he was staying at home, Craig thought that Kathleen was coping very well with being a mom. She really appeared to enjoy Patrick, and he saw no signs of her being depressed or irritated. Life was going so well at that point that Craig decided he might as well return to work. And of course this would be a decision he would ultimately regret, although there's probably nothing he could have done either way.
No.
So on Wednesday, October 17th, 1990, Craig came home from the 3rd day in his new job to what he saw as a happy, normal family. Kathleen fed Patrick, dressed him in a fresh diaper and pajamas, and tucked him into his crib at 8:30 p.m. 2 hours later, Craig went in and kissed Patrick goodnight. The lamp was on then, and Patrick was sleeping soundly on his back. Kathleen would later say that she fed Patrick at 1 a.m. before she went back to bed. Kathleen said then that she woke up later in the night for no particular reason. She went into the bathroom to pee, then went in to check on Patrick on her way back. When she stopped at his door to check on him, though, she noticed his breathing was labored. It seemed like he was trying really hard to catch his breath. So she turned the light on, and Craig was awoken again by her screams. He ran to the baby's room in a complete panic. How could this have happened again? But Kathleen was screaming at the foot of the crib. The side of the crib was still up. Patrick was lying on his back with the covers down near the foot of the mattress. His eyes were closed, so he looked like he was sleeping. But Kathleen was still at the end of the crib, and she wouldn't stop screaming. Craig went over and picked up the baby and screamed at Kathleen to call the ambulance. As he held Patrick in his arms, he heard some noise coming from Patrick. The baby was breathing. He was still warm and his skin was pink. He was so thankful. Craig put him on the floor and started to do CPR on him, putting his mouth over Patrick's mouth and nose the way he'd been shown by the SIDS educators. At 4:41 a.m. on Thursday, October 18, 1990, Officer Hopkins, along with another paramedic, arrived at the scene. It was a scene very similar to the one that he had been called out to for Caleb Folbigg just a little over a year earlier. Kathleen told him that Patrick was having trouble breathing, he was pale, and he was struggling to breathe. So Hopkins took over with Patrick, and right away he could see that the baby was listless with a decreased level of consciousness. He was in some very serious respiratory distress.
Yeah, he was using all the muscles in his abdomen and between his ribs in his efforts to get air into the lungs. Hopkins also noted a little tugging in the neck at the trachea, where the pressure of inspiration pulls the skin and soft tissues of the neck. So what we call that is retractions. And he had a lot of those. He's working really hard to breathe. Paramedics sat Patrick on Kathleen's lap on the stretcher and gave him oxygen on the way to the hospital. Now, as soon as he was given oxygen, his eyes opened up. And this is even though he had a lot of trouble breathing. By 4:52 in the morning, the ambulance arrived at the ER with Patrick. So they ruled out serious illnesses such as meningitis, sepsis, and other bacterial infections. Blood was sent to the Adelaide Children's Hospital for testing to check for any chemical abnormalities. and they checked his white cells. And they found no genetic diseases that could have caused neurological abnormalities. According to the pediatrician, Patrick's condition was consistent with him suffering a catastrophic asphyxiating event from unknown causes.
So what is a catastrophic asphyxiating event?
Well, so they're saying that something caused his airway to be blocked.
Smothered.
That's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
He could have aspirated milk formula. I don't know. It would seem that they were suspicious.
Yeah, I mean, catastrophic sounds like it was really bad.
Well, it was. He had a lot of sequelae from this.
Yes.
So he suffered oxygen deprivation to the brain. And over time, he had changes in the gray matter of his brain that resulted in seizures. So with oxygen deprivation, there oftentimes is severe swelling of the brain, and this can lead to scarring of the brain because of this lack of oxygen. This is called gliosis. So it can result in an irritation of the normal electric activity in the brain, which can result in seizures. And this is what he had.
So Patrick was discharged from the hospital on October 29th. His physician completed a 5-page discharge summary. He never believed that Patrick had encephalitis, a viral inflammation of the brain, because no tests or lumbar punctures showed any evidence of that. So he couldn't find a medical cause for Patrick's illness. Patrick's CAT scan on admission to the hospital showed a normal brain, but unfortunately as time passed, the damage that had been done to his brain became more and more clear. He did survive, but was later diagnosed with epilepsy and cortical blindness, and he would die 4 months later, February 13th, 1991, and he was in the care of his mother while his father was at work. So it was just after 10 a.m. when Kathleen called Craig's sister Carol at her home. Kathleen told her sister-in-law that it had happened again. So Carol got into her car and drove over. In the house, she found Kathleen sitting on the couch with her elbows on her knees, crying and waiting for the ambulance. She was also waiting for Craig to arrive. She had called him. Carol walked into Patrick's bedroom and found him lying in his crib, just as he had looked on other occasions when she'd put him down for sleep. She moved to pick him up, but Kathleen told her, "No, don't do that." And that's when Carol realized that Patrick was dead. Craig had been called at work by a frantic-sounding Kathleen, and once home he found the baby still lying on his back in the crib. So they're not doing anything to try and save the baby, besides calling the ambulance. Craig right away picked up Patrick, and he could feel that he was floppy but still warm, but also his lips were blue. So Craig tried to resuscitate him until the paramedics arrived. Patrick's physician met the Folbiggs at the ER. Patrick was unresponsive, and he had no spontaneous breathing and no pulse. So the doctor told Craig and Kathleen the terrible news that Patrick was dead, and all efforts to resuscitate him were stopped at that point. Craig just couldn't believe it. So slides with tissue sections from Patrick's brain were sent to the Royal Alexandra Hospital for Children at Camperdown, along with the autopsy report. Doctors concluded that Patrick's brain damage was caused by a lack of oxygen to his brain during the episode he'd had about 5 months before he died. The official cause of death was that Patrick had suffocated as the result of an epileptic seizure. So Craig suffered profound grief, and he withdrew even more than he had after Caleb's death. He actually lost his job and started spending most of his time alone. His one escape that he enjoyed was to see friends and spend time with other people's children. But again, Kathleen seemed to move forward much more easily, going out to see friends and dancing at nightclubs within weeks. But Craig just told himself that everyone grieves differently. And I think that's true to a certain point. But it does get to a point with her where it just seems abnormal. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm kind of mixed on that. I think certainly, everybody has a different method of grieving. So I wouldn't necessarily think that she was celebrating or whooping it up. Maybe she's still in shock. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt.
Okay, well, there's 2 babies. You're giving her the benefit of the doubt. I can't wait to see how you are after the 3rd and 4th baby.
Well, I'll change my mind.
You probably will.
Now, after losing Patrick, Kathleen didn't want to live in the house anymore, not with their sad memories. So they moved into a new house that they had bought in Thornton. And as they tried to move forward with their lives, Craig started working again. And then Kathleen surprised him by telling him that she wanted to have another baby. That would be a surprise, I gotta tell you.
Yeah, almost a shock, really.
Yeah.
This episode is sponsored by Apostrophe, a prescription skincare company for people who are ready to take their acne seriously. Fun fact, most home remedies and over-the-counter acne products don't work. And even worse, they can really damage your skin. That brings me back to when I was in my early teens and I was told to use toothpaste on my pimples. And in case you're wondering, it didn't work. I smelled minty, however, so there is that. But now that I'm older and wiser, I want real medicine for my real skin issues from a prescription skincare company. But prescription acne treatment can be hard to get. You have to take time off work, see a doctor, and then line up at the pharmacy to get the medication. But Apostrophe is different. They connect you with a board-certified dermatologist who will create a personalized treatment plan that is just perfectly tailored to your unique skin. Simply fill out Apostrophe's online quiz about your skin goals and medical history. Then you snap a few selfies, and your dermatologist will create your customized treatment plan. And the best part is that Apostrophe offers topical and oral medications, so you can treat your acne from the inside out or from the outside in. Apostrophe can help you with acne, but they can also hit your other skincare goals like redness, wrinkles, and my personal nemesis, dark spots. Apostrophe has helped me out with prescription strength creams to lighten dark spots and prevent adult acne outbreaks. It's so nice to know that a real dermatologist is developing your custom skincare plan. My tretinoin and niacin cream came in this easy-to-use pump bottle with some adorable stickers to personalize my bottle. It's a little touch I wouldn't have thought of, but Apostrophe provides a really pleasant, hassle-free experience. We have a special deal for our audience. Save $15 off your first visit with a board-certified dermatologist at apostrophe.com/TCB when you use our code TCB. This code is only available to our listeners. To get started, go to apostrophe.com/TCB and click Begin Visit. Then use our code TCB at sign up, and you'll get $15 off your dermatology visit. That's apostrophe.com/TCB. And use that code TCB to get your dermatology visit and save $15. And we thank Apostrophe for sponsoring this podcast.
After Kathleen told Craig that she thought she'd like to try to have another baby, he said he just couldn't face the thought of having another child because he couldn't survive another loss. Kathleen countered that with that she was prepared to risk that pain again. Having another child would be a true leap of faith for the couple. But according to Craig, there is an ultimatum with this. Have another child, or I'm leaving you. Craig still wanted to be a dad, but he certainly had questions and concerns. After losing Caleb and Patrick, was it right to risk another baby's life and their own happiness? They said he needed time to think, and Kathleen gave him a week. That's it.
That's it.
So they talked it over, and eventually Craig agreed that they would try for another baby. Only if they consulted and involved the sudden infant death syndrome experts after the baby was born. And Kathleen agreed to this.
So it was just 1 year after Patrick's death when Kathleen told Craig she was pregnant. Craig was hopeful now that their lives would be different this time and their baby would live. They were reassured by the SIDS experts, who explained that they would be offered a sleep apnea monitor after the baby was born. And of course it would be very rare for this to happen 3 times in one family. Sarah Folbigg was born on October 14, 1992. The labor with their third child lasted about 6 hours, and Kathleen delivered a healthy, blue-eyed blonde girl, and she didn't even need any medications. Craig and his sister Carol were there for Sarah's birth. Craig and Kathleen borrowed a wooden sleeping rocker from Carol, and they also received an apnea blanket from the SIDS organization. This blanket was kind of like a mat, and it would alarm when it didn't detect any motion from the baby after 30 seconds. But this became a real source of stress for Kathleen and Craig because the alarm would go off if Sarah moved at all during the night. So it was going off a lot during the night. Kathleen would get up and check on her, and neither Kathleen nor Craig felt confident about how to use the apnea machine either. They hadn't even been instructed on its use. So they had just followed the basic instructions given on the box that it came in.
Yeah, well, this was a typical complaint from people that were on monitors in that time. I didn't have that many kids, but almost universally the ones that were on the home monitor, that was the chief complaint from the parents. It goes off all the time.
Yes, which makes it really, it doesn't even really work because you start ignoring it.
Certainly makes it less effective.
Yeah.
Now, when Sarah was just over 2 months old, Kathleen complained that she is sick of being broke and stuck at home, so she took a job working on weekends. And as Sarah got older, Kathleen's frustration with the sleep apnea machine got worse and worse. The constant false alarms during the night were interrupting her sleep.
Well, Kathleen found the alarms irritating, but Craig found them comforting. He wasn't going to give up on it. According to Craig, Kathleen never spoke of any concerns for Sarah's safety related to the alarm going off. She seemed to develop alarm fatigue, assuming that the beeping was always a false alarm. So the couple argued about Kathleen's reluctance to use the monitor. Kathleen had nicknamed Sarah the catnapper because she wouldn't sleep for more than 15 or 20 minutes at a time. Sarah's restless sleeping patterns only improved when she was in bed with her parents. So Kathleen began keeping Sarah in her and Craig's bed with them at night, which I think is very dangerous.
Well, it's certainly, these days, it's not recommended.
No. Well, if you've already lost two, I think that's a very risky thing to do.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But I don't think at that time, close to 30 years ago, that was the concern.
Well, I suppose not. But Craig's family members did take care of Sarah when Kathleen and Craig both worked on Saturdays. The babysitters all took a CPR course, too, before they cared for Sarah. But for an unknown reason, Kathleen and Craig never took a CPR class.
Well, he was sort of taught some basics, because when the second child had his problems, he did some resuscitation. I mean, he knew...
He did know to blow air.
Yeah, he knew the basics.
Right, exactly. So it was Sunday, August 29th, 1993, and Craig and Kathleen took Sarah out for a date at the beach. She was 10 months old. Now, even though she had had a mild cold, she was acting like she was just fine. She played in the sand and chased after seagulls and had a great day. They had an uneventful evening, too, eating dinner and bathing Sarah before putting her to bed. After this really busy day, Kathleen was tired, and according to Craig, she was in a bad mood. In the last couple of days, they decided on a new bedtime routine for Sarah, so she was now in her own single-sized bed that they had set up at the foot of their bed. Craig had also given in, and they were no longer using the apnea blanket.
Now, as Craig's sitting in the living room, he could hear Kathleen in the bedroom with Sarah. Sarah was crying and fussy. He suddenly heard something that was quite concerning to him, and that was that Kathleen was growling like a dog. Weird.
Yes.
So he ran to the bedroom, and there's Kathleen on the bed. She's got Sarah pinned to her in a one-armed hug, and with the other arm, she's patting Sarah on the bottom. But it was more than a pat. It was probably a spank.
Yeah, it didn't look gentle.
So Craig asked Kathleen to calm down, and she told him to fuck off.
Yeah, so she was in a bad mood, I guess.
I guess so. So he returned to the living room, and he could still hear Sarah fussing. Then Kathleen walked into the living room, stopped in front of Craig. She threw the baby at him and yelled, "You fucking deal with her." So,
wow.
Yeah, kind of lost it.
Yeah.
Craig caught his daughter, and his wife stormed off back to the bedroom. So he cuddled and fed Sarah, and eventually she fell asleep. Then around 11 o'clock at night, Craig put Sarah into her bed in their room, tucking in a sheet and blanket around her body before getting into bed with his wife, and he went to sleep. He next remembered waking up around 1:10, and he looked around the room. Kathleen wasn't in bed with him, and Sarah wasn't in her bed either. The bedroom doors were closed, but he could see that light was on the other side of it, so he thought Kathleen was up taking care of Sarah, and he went back to sleep.
But then Craig was awoken by Kathleen screaming. The light was on in the bedroom, and he sat right up in bed. Kathleen was standing with one hand on the door, screaming. Craig jumped up out of bed and saw Sarah lying in bed on her back. He had never seen her sleep like that, lying out flat, so he hurried over to her and picked her up, and she felt floppy. So this was at 1:34 a.m. He had just woken up 20 minutes earlier, and Kathleen and Sarah were not in the room. Kathleen now was sitting in the hallway just outside the bedroom door, screaming and crying. What had happened in those 20 minutes? He didn't know, but it was weird. Sarah was still warm, and Craig was listening to see if she was breathing. She wasn't. So he yelled at Kathleen to call an ambulance, and he tried to do CPR, blowing into her nose and pressing down on her chest. But remember, despite the 2 deaths of his other children, he hadn't taken a CPR class, which probably would have been a good idea.
I would think.
Because
right?
there are other things to know than just breathing air and pushing on the chest.
There certainly are. Now later on, Kathleen gave her version of what had happened. She said that she had gotten up to go to the bathroom and glanced over and saw that Sarah wasn't moving. So she went over to make sure the baby wasn't cold or anything and covered her up. And that's when she noticed she wasn't hearing any breathing. So she woke Craig up and he turned on the light. And she remembered calling for the ambulance and seeing Craig doing CPR. According to the ambulance log, the emergency call was received at 1:24 a.m. and the ambulance was at the scene at 1:30 in the morning. Sarah had mucus and vomit in her mouth and she wasn't breathing. And as the paramedics worked on her, Craig told them that they had just stopped using Sarah's apnea blanket. Sarah did not respond to resuscitation efforts, and this included drugs like adrenaline. 40 minutes after help had arrived at the Folbigg home, Craig and Kathleen were told the devastating news. Sarah was dead. Her body was brought out to the living room where Craig held her and cried. It had happened again. Craig called his brothers and sisters, and 2 of them showed up just minutes before 2 detectives and a police photographer arrived. So the stories that the parents give are slightly different from each other.
They are, yes.
So the postmortem was done on Sarah's body by the head of the Institute of Forensic Medicine, Professor John Hilton, and this was done the day after she died. At the time, Hilton didn't consider Sarah's death to be suspicious. Her body was well nourished and there were no signs of abuse. He did notice that Sarah had 2 tiny puncture marks on her face, more like on her chin, below her lower lip, and she had a small scratch on her arm. He also noticed that Sarah's uvula, that's that little hangy thing in your throat, was displaced. That's an observation. There isn't any medical issue with that.
Okay.
So there was no obvious cause of death. 2 of her siblings had died, and one of them, Caleb, had been diagnosed as having died from SIDS. Sarah's death was very concerning because of the history in the family of a previous death attributed to SIDS. So Professor Hilton called Craig and Kathleen and asked them to meet him at his office in Sydney. And Craig's sister Carol and her husband Robert went along with them.
So Hilton told them that he couldn't explain Sarah's death, but it was a terrible case of bad luck. There was no reason he could see why they shouldn't have another child. He told them not to let the 3 tragedies stand in their way. He determined that the cause of death was SIDS because there was no other reason why she died. The decision to attribute Sarah's death to SIDS instead of calling it undetermined spared the parents from questions they would have been asked at an inquest. So Kathleen Folbigg was in the clear. But Craig still had questions. A couple of days after Sarah died, he tried to talk with Kathleen. When he had first woken up on the night of Sarah's death, about 20 minutes before Kathleen had woken him with her screams, he had seen that neither she nor Sarah were in the bedroom, and he wanted to know what happened. She said she got up and went to the toilet. She came back, turned on the light, and found her not breathing. She said, "That's it, the rest you know," and that was the end of the conversation. So she refused to talk to Craig about any of their children after they died, pretty much. She never even mentioned their names again. But Craig did wonder why his wife had gotten out of bed to go to the bathroom at 1:30, just over 20 minutes after he knew she'd already been out of the room with Sarah.
Well, yeah, that's a good question.
It is, but he, pushed it aside.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't going to talk about it.
No,
so
she wasn't.
There wasn't really anything he could do to gain any further understanding.
No. So it's his wife. He's going to just support her.
Yeah.
But 2 years after Sarah died, he was still grieving. Kathleen then wrote him a letter with an ultimatum. She wanted him to see a grief counselor or she would leave him. She decided that a separation would be the best thing for him because since Sarah's death he'd been distant, and they moved several times over those 2 years. The couple just hadn't been able to get back on track after Sarah's death. They'd separated and reconciled several times before Kathleen gave Craig her written ultimatum. So Craig was dealing with his grief, for the most part by filling his time with work, becoming a bit of a workaholic and just avoiding it. But he watched as Kathleen moved on with her life without him or her 3 babies. She was exercising at the gym, going out dancing at the nightclubs, hanging out with his sister. Now he really loved and missed Kathleen, so he agreed he would see a grief counselor. And they began seeing a counselor together, and the relationship did improve. So they decided they'd give their marriage another try. Kathleen got a job with an electrical appliance supplier, and she moved into a rented flat with Craig. But Kathleen's foster mother disliked Craig and stopped speaking with Kathleen because she got back with him. Her foster family moved away, and Kathleen said she felt like she'd lost them for good. Now she had no blood family or her foster family. But just as she had with the deaths of her kids, she blocked out the loss and just moved forward as if nothing had changed. She didn't want to talk about it.
No, she didn't. Now that she and Craig had reunited, they borrowed some money to buy their dream house. And this was a modern home in Singleton. So for a time, everything seemed to be getting better for the couple. Kathleen told Craig how wonderful she felt their lives were now that they had a beautiful house and 2 good jobs. But then she said the one thing that would make their lives complete was if they had another baby. Craig, probably understandably, was a little shocked at this because they'd already discussed it and decided that they didn't want to be parents again.
Yes, they were moving forward, deciding not to be parents.
But Kathleen was persistent.
Yeah, now she did know that Craig always wanted to be a dad, so to persuade him that having another baby was a good idea, she just kept at him. Of course, he was terrified that if they had another child, it would die. But Kathleen insisted that it wouldn't happen again, which was weird, as if she had some control over it. She said that they were more mature and would be better parents, but that seemed really odd. What did their maturity have to do with their babies dying? Her whole outlook on it was just really weird. But to keep Kathleen happy, Craig called Professor Hilton, who referred him to a Dr. Christopher Seaton at the Sleep Investigation Unit at a children's hospital in Sydney. So he already knew about the Folbiggs' losses, and he invited them to Sydney to talk with them. He told them there was no reason why they shouldn't have another baby. Craig badly wanted to be a dad, but he didn't want to go through the pain of losing another child. But technology had advanced, and the understanding of SIDS and how to prevent it had made some progress. By the time they left the meeting, Craig was feeling a little bit reassured. He really loved Kathleen and hoped there was a chance that they could have a family together. So once again, Craig and Kathleen committed to having another baby. In her diary on June 18, 1996, Kathleen wrote, "I'm ready this time, and I know I'll have help and support this time. When I think I'm going to lose control like last time, I'll just hand baby over to someone else." It's just very strange, isn't it?
It is.
By November 1996, she was pregnant too. And on December 4th, she confided more of her feelings about motherhood in her diary. "I'm ready this time," she wrote. "But I have already decided if I get any feelings of jealousy or anger too much, I will leave Craig and the baby rather than answer being as before. Silly, but will be the only way I will cope. I think support and not being afraid to ask for it will be a major plus. Also, I have and will change my attitude and try earnestly not to let anything stress me to the max. I will do anything to pamper myself regularly and just deal with things. If I have a clingy baby, then so be it. A cat napper, so be it. That will be when I will ask for help and sleep whenever I can to keep myself in a decent mood. I know now that battling wills and sleep deprivation were the causes last time. So I feel like these excerpts are very incriminating.
Well, I think given what happened, yeah, you can be real suspicious of them.
Absolutely. She even mentions being jealous and angry.
Yeah.
Changing her attitude, trying to be in a better mood. Yeah, I think that's very suggestive of her having something to do with those children being killed.
And she's talking about, ask for help.
Mm-hmm. So it's absolutely like someone who's made mistakes before and this time is going to do things differently.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, she doesn't say, I killed my other babies.
She doesn't. But some of that wording makes me think she's purposely trying to be vague to protect herself. Because some of the wording is just very strange.
It really is.
Yeah.
So she went into labor just after midnight on August 7th, 1997, and delivered a little girl that they named Laura. Now, as soon as she was delivered, Craig held the baby in his arms, and he prayed that this time his baby would be all right. Kathleen stayed in the hospital with Laura for 5 days, and this was the first baby she breastfed. But she didn't enjoy it. Once she got home, she started bottle feeding Laura. When Laura was just over a week old, the family drove over to Sydney and stayed overnight at the Royal Alexandra Hospital for Children to get Laura tested for any illness or abnormality. And finally, they got their CPR lessons. So Laura was fitted with an electronic chorometrics monitor, and the nurse explained to them how the machine worked to record and measure Laura's breathing and heartbeat, and how it would alarm if there was a stoppage of breathing or any changes in the baby's heartbeat. Craig and Kathleen were shown how to use the monitor and how to respond by touching Laura gently to check whether she responds. The machine could show whether it was a heart alarm, a breathing alarm, or a false alarm.
Well, every detail of every alarm had to be written in a daily diary, and the data recorded on the machine's memory had to be downloaded to the hospital so the experts could interpret them. The tests on Laura in the neonatal intensive care unit all came back supporting that she was a healthy infant. She was diagnosed with central apnea, which is of no medical significance, which is very much unlike obstructive apnea.
Right.
So can you explain the difference?
Well, central apnea is just what we call periodic breathing. Babies' respiratory rates can vary tremendously, and sometimes they can go for a minute or so without seeming to breathe at all. But then they start again. Now, obstructive apnea means that there's something blocking the airway, so you're not going to start breathing again. But central apnea, periodic breathing, is a benign, self-limited disorder.
So she was a normal child.
She was, at least from the testing they did.
But what did seem abnormal to some of the medical professionals was Kathleen's behavior. They observed that Kathleen just didn't act like other parents who had lost a baby to SIDS. They expected her to be overprotective. That was what normally happened, but she wasn't. And the relationship between mother and daughter appeared difficult. Kathleen seemed detached, as if she didn't want to get close to Laura. The clinical nurse consultant later said that Kathleen wasn't watching Laura. She'd go out and have a cigarette or go out and have a break very often. Now, in contrast, Craig was absolutely terrified. He needed to be reassured that his daughter was healthy and that they had the very latest technology. He just wanted to keep her safe no matter what. So he was reassured by their trip to the hospital, and he was very involved with Laura when they returned home. He felt hopeful that he knew they had a healthy daughter, and he really wanted to be involved. But Kathleen still took over the responsibilities at night. Laura slept in a bassinet right next to her parents' bed, and the electrodes of the monitor were strapped to her body so she could be plugged into the machine whenever she was sleeping. So it was on her every time she slept. The monitor was really protecting Laura, but not in the way Craig or the experts would think that it was. It was actually protecting the little girl from her mother, I think. In her diary on August 25th, 1997, and that's 18 days after Laura's birth, Kathleen wrote in her diary, "Scary feelings. I've realized I actually love her and have bonded with her, wish to protect her, etc. Maternal instinct is what they call it. I now know I never had it with the others. Monitor is a good idea. Nothing can happen without the monitor knowing. And since I'm not game enough to not plug it in because they'd want to know why I hadn't, everything will be fine this time.
Oh, that's interesting.
That is.
I'm going to make sure I keep it plugged in, because if I don't, they'll be suspicious of me.
Yes. So it seems like as time goes on, the excerpts are more and more incriminating.
And by the time Laura was 6 weeks old, things had settled into a routine. Craig was getting used to the alarm and managing to sleep through it, and Kathleen would deal with the baby alone.
That's scary.
That is. I guess he still doesn't have any suspicions of her.
Well, he would say that he had little inklings in his mind, but he always pushed them aside because he really loved her and didn't think she'd really done it.
Yeah, because if he was, he would have made sure that he was always available to take care of her, the baby.
Or he wouldn't even have been with her and consented to having another baby.
Right.
But on September 20th, 1997, Catherine wrote in her diary again, "Sleep. Who needs it? Yes, I'm getting a bit irritable now. This is my punishment for the others, to be continually woken up, because this time we know that we have a child with a sleeping disorder. Even though I'm sure they are all false alarms, the thought is still scary. I'm getting very stressed because I can't depend on Craig for any real support or help. He doesn't hear her or the alarms. How dare he complain to me about a lack of sleep? What the fuck would he know? Think he'll have to sleep in the other room, just so he's not disturbed. Selfish prick. Well, now I know where I stand. Craig is refusing to help and hasn't even attempted to in any way. Just wants me to bear all the stress so he can keep selling his cars and making money. I suppose the stress of having to provide for us is real, but it's nothing compared to this." So it seemed like Kathleen didn't take the risk of losing Laura very seriously. She's more concerned about other things. It's really odd she didn't think that Laura could stop breathing in her sleep, just like her brothers and sister had.
Mm-hmm.
But every time Craig brought this up, Kathleen was angry with him. So he wrote to the nurse clinician at the children's hospital and explained his concerns. The arguments between Craig and Kathleen continued over her inconsistent use of the monitor, and she eventually convinced Craig to reduce the use of the monitor during the daytime. They still continued to use it throughout the nights. When the alarm went off, Laura would be woken a little bit, but she'd always go right back to sleep. But in her diary, Kathleen acknowledged that things were not good. On January 16, 1998, when Laura was 5 months old, Kathleen wrote about how she longed for a life away from her husband and daughter. Then a few days later, on January 20th, she wrote, "Very depressed with myself, angry and upset. I've done it. I've lost it with her. I yelled at her so angry that it scared her. She hasn't stopped crying. Got so bad I nearly purposely dropped her on the floor and left her. I was restrained enough to walk away, went to my room and left her to cry. Was probably gone only 5 minutes, but it seemed like a lifetime. I feel like the worst mother in this earth, scared that she'll leave me now like Sarah did. I knew I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her, and she left, with a bit of help. I don't want that to ever happen again. I actually seem to have a bond with Laura. It can't happen again. I'm ashamed of myself. I can't tell Craig about it because he'll worry about leaving her with me. Only seems to happen if I'm too tired. Her moaning, bored, whining sound drives me up the wall. I truly can't wait until she's old enough to tell me what she wants."
So this entry sounds like she's confessing.
It does.
When she talks about Sarah, how she left with a bit of help.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Suspicious.
Yes.
Okay, the next meeting the Folbiggs had with Dr. Seaton was that May. With the most common time of danger for Sid's death now past, Seaton told him that they could return the monitor. Craig, though, was hesitant. He wanted to keep it a few more months. Laura's first birthday was celebrated that August, and they had a grand party at the Folbiggs' backyard. Laura had lived longer than any of her siblings, certainly a cause for celebration. The nurse clinician drove up from Sydney and told them they could keep the Corometrics monitor for a little longer if they liked. But Laura had been a healthy, normal child. The sickest Laura had been was in June 1998, when she was admitted to the local hospital overnight for croup, and the admission was mostly precautionary due to their family history.
Right. So in December of 1998, when Laura was 16 months old, the Children's Hospital asked the Folbiggs to return the monitor. The danger of SIDS was well past. Reluctantly, Craig drove down to Sydney to return it. While Laura's health and growth were excellent, the relationship between her parents was deteriorating since Laura had started walking at about 11 months. She was becoming independent. And Kathleen was becoming more irritated with Craig, and she also would seem inappropriately angry with Laura when she didn't obey. Craig kept his opinions to himself about Kathleen's frequent trips to the gym and her weekly nights out with the girls. By the time Laura was 18 months old, Kathleen wrote to Craig telling him that she wanted to end the marriage. She told him that she felt like she couldn't communicate with him. She wrote, "Over the years you have become an oppressive and depressing person. I only see sparks, and tiny ones at that, of the man that attracted me all those years ago." So this letter hurt Craig. He told her that he thought the marriage could be saved. He was horrified when she told him that although she did want to go off by herself, she planned to take Laura and leave her somewhere she thought her daughter would be safe until she returned. She wasn't planning to leave Laura with him. He told her to leave if she must, but she wouldn't be taking Laura with her. But Craig was still very much in love with Kathleen. On February 17, 1999, he typed up a reply to her letter, and he wrote, "Through the good times and bad, through richer or poorer, through sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live, these words I hold true as they were my oath to you. I love you and desire you with every fiber of my being, and I am proud of your achievements with your weight loss and your efforts in those regards. I am immensely proud of the mother you are to Laura. It is something I have wished for a long time." So after he finished typing up that letter, Craig sat back and read it, and he felt unsettled. He would say that he had these feelings of doubt disturbing him, and he couldn't give the letter to Kathleen until he felt better about their marriage and better about her role as a mother to Laura. But then he and Kathleen did make up, and they decided to try and save their marriage.
Laura was 18 months old, and Craig one day noticed an odd tension between her and Kathleen one Sunday morning. So when he asked her why Laura was avoiding eye contact with her, Kathleen explained that she had lost her temper with Laura the day before. She said that Laura wouldn't stop harassing her, so she had yelled at her, "Piss off," and accidentally knocked her over to the floor. Kathleen told Craig that the sight of Laura crying on the floor had upset her, and she had immediately sat down and tried to calm her. Afterwards, Kathleen had settled her down and put her to bed. But just hearing this story about how she yelled at the kid, "Piss off," and knocked her to the floor, that's pretty shocking to Craig.
Well, and we've mentioned 2 of these incidents, but I'm sure there had to be more. So I really feel like Craig might have been missing something here.
Oh, I would bet on it.
Yeah.
Hi guys, Dick here. If you enjoy True Crime Brewery podcasts, but are irritated by the ads, you might want to consider becoming a member. For as little as $4 a month, you can listen to ad-free episodes and also have access to a bonus episode each month. Now that might sound pretty good, but there's more to this deal. When you become a member, you'll get some swag, like a snifter or a bottle opener or some coasters, plus some other stuff Jill likes to throw in. I think it's a great deal. All you have to do is go to the website, tiegrabber.com, click on subscribe. It's that simple.
It was March 1st, 1999, when Laura did die while she was home alone with her mother. Kathleen would call an ambulance and perform CPR, but 19-month-old Laura could not be resuscitated. Laura was far too old to die from sudden infant death syndrome, and a physician who came to the scene told the police this. So if you're saying that to the police, there are definitely some suspicions.
So it seems. Earlier that day, the day she died, in the morning, Craig had overheard Kathleen growling at Laura in rage and frustration. The baby fell to the kitchen floor, just totally terrified, shaking and crying. Craig ran down the hall and was standing at the kitchen entrance. Kathleen had been pinning Laura's arms behind her in the high chair and telling her to eat her breakfast. But Laura didn't want to eat, and this made Kathleen angry. So Craig went to Laura and picked her up, walking with her back down the hall to the bedroom. Craig held his daughter and spoke softly to her, calming her. But then Kathleen stormed in, demanding, "Give me that baby and get ready for work. Get out. You make her behave like this. This is your fault." And she grabbed Laura's arm and scooped her off her father's lap. So he showered and got dressed for work, and was listening for what was going on with his wife and daughter. By the time he was ready to leave, things had settled down. Kathleen saw him in the kitchen, and she pointed to Laura, who was now watching TV in the family room. She told him that Laura only acted up and cried when he was around. So Craig said, "Okay," off he goes to work.
Well, and then Kathleen went to the gym that morning, leaving Laura in the on-site daycare while she worked out. After she left the gym, she stopped by Craig's workplace. And Laura was very active and giggly as Craig showed her around and showed her off to his coworkers. Kathleen seemed to be in a much better mood too. But then within an hour, Craig was called with the news that little Laura had been taken to the hospital. According to Kathleen, Laura had fallen asleep on the ride home. After she pulled into their driveway, Kathleen carried her to her bedroom and lay her on the bed. She then went outside and played with the dog, cleaned up the patio, and hung out the wash. Now, because of what had happened to their other 3 children, the Folbiggs had an audio baby monitor that they used to listen to Laura whenever she was in her room. Kathleen told Craig that she had heard Laura cough and sputter on the monitor, but that she didn't rush in right away to see what was wrong. I find that very weird. After losing 3 children?
Yeah, anything that goes on out of the ordinary, you'd be on it.
Yes. 5 or 10 minutes later, she went into Laura's bedroom to check on her and found her pale with blue lips. She also felt cool to the touch. Kathleen said she then picked her up and ran into the kitchen with her, put her on a bench in the kitchen and started doing CPR. And she also called for an ambulance. It took only 2 minutes from the time she made the call for the ambulance to show up, and Kathleen was found crying and doing CPR. Laura wasn't breathing and had no pulse. They rushed Laura into the ambulance and raced to the hospital while continuing resuscitation attempts. But a short time after the paramedics turned Laura over to the hospital staff, she was pronounced dead. So the Folbiggs have lost a 4th child. Craig's family came in to offer support. A friend and neighbor, Melissa Smith, whose own son had died of SIDS in 1998, rushed to the hospital, and she found Kathleen sitting in a chair, shaking and crying hysterically. But Kathleen would never show any emotion for Laura again. At 5 p.m., the Folbiggs went home. The police investigated the house, which was the standard procedure whenever a child died. But police would end up seizing Kathleen's diaries, and these included the 1996 entry made after the deaths of her first 3 children, in which she wrote, "Obviously, I am my father's daughter." And the police would interpret this as a confession that she too was a killer, like her dad had been. The day after Laura's death, neighbors, family, and friends visited the Folbiggs to express their condolences and offer their support, and everyone who visited them that day would remember that Craig was very distraught. But the descriptions of Kathleen's behavior varied by who you were talking to. Neighbors would say they saw no emotion from her, but her friends from the gym saw a very upset, grieving mother. A gym instructor had been leading a fitness class on Monday when Kathleen had told her that Laura had been unwell and that she was going to take her home for a nap. It was only a couple of hours later that the gym instructor received the call from Kathleen telling her that Laura had died. So the instructor later said she found Kathleen to be as upset as any mother would be.
Now, Craig would say later that the death of Laura filled him with anger. He was devastated, but mostly he was angry. He told police that Kathleen cried on cue, and that she was only inconsolable when her friends were there feeling sorry for her.
Yeah, at Laura's wake, Craig was upset about the inappropriate behavior of Kathleen. He noticed that she spent time laughing and joking with her friends. And when he later talked about Kathleen's conversation with her friends, he was really bitter about it. Just days after Laura's funeral, Kathleen's friends picked her up to go to the gym. And after a few weeks, she returned to work and started going out to clubs with her friends again. To Craig, his wife was acting like Laura had never existed, and now he was really angry.
Now, 6 weeks after the baby died, Kathleen packed her bags and moved out on her own to an apartment on the other side of town. So here's Craig now with 4 children that he's lost and his wife. Now, despite all the pain in his life, he tried to carry on. Kathleen was back to her normal self, going on about her life. And they talked, but she showed no signs of wanting to reconcile with him. Craig asked Kathleen what she wanted him to do with the belongings she had left in their house. And she said, just throw away anything that was belonging to me. So Craig sorted through cupboards and drawers. When Craig opened Kathleen's bedside drawer, he found her diary, and that changed everything for him.
Yes, now Kathleen's handwritten diary covered June 1996 to June 1997, and it made him question everything he had ever believed. He read what she'd written on June 18th, 1996, when she had been trying to conceive her 4th child, Laura. I'm ready this time, and I know I'll have help and support this time. When I think I'm going to lose control like last times, I'll just hand baby over to someone else and not feel totally alone. Getting back to my exercise will help my state of mind and sleeping wherever possible as well. I have learned my lesson this time. And then on September 8th, 1996, she had written, Feel now is the time for us to have another baby. Have finally realized it's the right time for me. I have Craig and he wants a child that I can give him, and I have enough friends now not to lose it like before. Then on October 14th, 1996, she wrote, Children thing isn't happening. Thinking of forgetting the idea. Nature, fate, and the man upstairs have decided I don't get a 4th chance, and rightly so, I suppose. Obviously, I am my father's daughter, but I think losing my temper and being frustrated with everything is past. I now just let things happen and go with the flow, an attitude I should have had with all of my children. If given the chance, I'll have it with the next one. So Craig really couldn't grasp the meaning of what he was reading. It was very bizarre. The next entry, 2 weeks later, on October 30th, 1996, made him have even more questions. I worry that my next child will suffer my psychological mood swings like the others did. I pray I'm prepared and ready, mind-wise, for the next one. Maybe nature has decided I never will be, and it will never happen. Kathleen's entry on December 4th, when she had already found out that she was pregnant with Laura, added to Craig's doubts and suspicions. I have and will change my attitude and try earnestly not to let anything stress me to the max. If I have a clingy baby, then so be it. A catnapper, so be it. And that will be when I ask for help and sleep whenever I can to keep myself in a decent mood. So Craig thought about the night Sarah died, and he remembered how he had woken in the middle of the night at 1:10 a.m. and saw Kathleen and Sarah were not in the room. The light had been shining under the door, and he'd gone back to sleep. And then 20 minutes later, he'd been woken by Kathleen's screams, and Sarah was dead in her bed. So Kathleen had told him she'd woken up and gone to the toilet, and then had come back to find Sarah dead. But if this were true, it meant that in 20 minutes she had got Sarah back to sleep, gotten back in bed herself, and then gotten up again to go to the bathroom. So Craig had some suspicions about that. He wondered if his wife had killed their children, and the idea made him feel physically ill. And finally, he decided he had to call the police.
And then 15 days after Laura's death, the doctor who had been on duty at the hospital that day had written to Detective Bernie Ryan and requested her death be treated as murder. The doctor had seen Craig run into the hospital calling for his daughter, throwing himself onto her body. The death of Laura and her father's grief had broken the doctor's heart. So he had checked the records. Laura had been through extensive testing before she was taken off her sudden infant death syndrome monitor. The doctor knew it wasn't a SIDS death, mostly because of her age. And there were a lot of coincidences with the other deaths. All the kids were healthy, had died alone in their mother's care, and there had been no obvious cause of death. Except for the first one, I think most of the children had been outside the age range for SIDS. Laura's body had been sent to pathologist Dr. Alan Calla at the New South Wales Institute of Forensic Medicine for the post-mortem. When he first examined Laura's body, March 1st, 1999, Dr. Kalla had been given an outline of the circumstances surrounding each of the deaths. This included the initial diagnosis of central apnea when Laura was just over a week old. The monitoring for over a year showed no significant sleep abnormalities. The doctor was aware of the cold and flu symptoms Laura had in the week before her death, and he knew that she had been given an antihistamine to treat it. He also knew that Laura had seemed healthy the day before she died, and that Kathleen had found her dead in bed after a morning nap. So, knowing this information, he did the post-mortem, and he found no cause of death. His examination found some old bruises on her legs, nowhere else, and those pretty normal for a child her age. He also found some mild inflammation of the heart muscle. This is known as myocarditis. Now, the inflammation he felt was consistent with the after effects of flu, and the doctor believed it had no role in her death. The only significant abnormalities were focally hemorrhagic and collapsed lungs. Laura's lungs had collapsed and bled a little bit, possibly during attempts to resuscitate her. Now, the autopsy on her sister Sarah was similar, but unlike Dr. Hilton, who had decided that Sarah had died from SIDS, Dr. Kalla's finding was that the blood in Sarah's lungs didn't show whether she had died from SIDS or whether she had been smothered. So it sounds like he's a little suspicious. He's reviewing the other child's autopsies. So Dr. Kalla went back 3 additional times to examine Laura's face, looking for any signs of smothering, but he found nothing. He did a facial dissection to look for small injuries beneath her skin, still found nothing. So rather than record a verdict of SIDS as Professor Hilton had done in the case of Sarah, Dr. Kalla gave the cause of death as undetermined. He was confident that Laura hadn't died from a natural process that could be attributed to SIDS. First thing was that she was almost 20 months old when she died, and classify as a SIDS death, it needs to happen usually within the ages of 3 to 6 months. So a 20-month-old would be very unlikely or impossible to be a result of SIDS. And then there was another common factor in SIDS deaths that didn't apply to Laura. SIDS children are normally found the morning following the night's sleep, hours after they've been fed in the middle of the night. Laura and all the other Folbigg children have been found by their mother just moments after she cared for them.
That's true, yeah. I didn't think of that.
So he expressed his concerns and suspicions to Detective Ryan.
Well, the detective asked Dr. Kalla to investigate all 4 of these deaths. He wanted a medical opinion about what had happened to Laura and if the same thing had happened to all of the Folbigg children. The pathologist took his own examination of Laura, as well as the medical histories and post-mortem reports of Caleb, Patrick, and Sarah, and applied them to the American Academy of Pediatrics criteria on distinguishing SIDS from fatal child abuse. Dr. Kalla agreed with the guidelines. SIDS was most common in babies between the ages of 1 and 6 months, with almost all SIDS cases happening before the baby reached 6 months of age. Now, Sarah was 10 months old when she died. The guidelines say that it's impossible to distinguish at autopsy between SIDS and accidental or deliberate asphyxiation with a soft object, but certain circumstances indicate the possibility of intentional suffocation. So what kind of circumstances would indicate that?
Well, if there was recurrent cyanotic episodes previous to the death, so bluing of the lips and fingers is cyanosis, and then apnea, episodes of apnea, or an acute life-threatening event, ALTE, while in the care of the same person. So that would make it suspicious. And we've got those in the 4 children.
Right, other deaths in the family.
So we have previous unexpected or unexplained deaths of 1 or more siblings, simultaneous or nearly simultaneous death of twins, that doesn't count in this case, previous death of infants under the care of the same unrelated person, and discovery of blood in the infant's nose or mouth in association with the life-threatening event. So he went back to Detective Ryan with his conclusions from the medical evidence. Caleb was younger than a month of age when he died. If Dr. Kalla had conducted the post-mortem on Caleb, he would have diagnosed the cause of death as undetermined. Caleb's death was consistent with him being deliberately suffocated, and the doctor felt there was no other explanation for his death. So he told the police that he did not agree with the original diagnosis that Caleb had died from SIDS.
Interesting.
Oh, there's more.
Okay.
Now, Patrick did have the life-threatening event prior to his demise.
Yes, he's the one who had that incident 5 months before his death and ended up having seizures.
So he felt that this was also consistent with him having been smothered. And he said if he had conducted a postmortem on Patrick, he would not have looked at epilepsy as a cause of death, but diagnosed it again as undetermined. So the autopsy results contain none of the clues he would have expected for a child's death from natural causes. Plus, Patrick was outside the guidelines' 6-month age limit for SIDS.
Well, with Sarah, Dr. Callis said he would have taken photos of those 2 tiny puncture marks on her chin. He also said he didn't think the marks were caused by attempts to resuscitate her, so he was convinced that an oxygen mask wouldn't have caused 2 tiny puncture marks, because the masks are soft around the edges and don't cause abrasions. And I'm assuming you'd agree with that, right?
I would.
So Sarah's death, in his opinion, was from an acute asphyxiating event of unknown causes, consistent with her being smothered. 3 of the children were older than the normal 6-month limit for SIDS. They were found by their mother almost immediately after they had stopped breathing, and their autopsies gave no clues to their cause of death. The doctor and the detective believed that Caleb, Patrick, Sarah, and Laura had all been murdered by their mother, but they didn't have any hard facts, such as a murder weapon, a confession, or any specific physical clues. So they really needed to work to put this together. And then the Detective Ryan, got a phone call from Craig Folbigg, and this was a big breakthrough.
Yeah.
Because this is after Craig had read those diaries.
Right, so he's convinced that his wife is a killer.
Yes. Now he will reverse on that and then come back to believe it again. So I think it was really difficult for him to accept that.
Oh, sure.
But the detective visited Craig and listened to his thoughts about the deaths. And Craig pointed out the inconsistencies in Kathleen's description of what had happened on the day of Laura's death, and explained how she had not been in her bed just 20 minutes before his wife claimed to have found Sarah not breathing. So reading Kathleen's thoughts had made sense of a lot of the questions that he had been keeping to himself. Detective Ryan traveled to the city of Minneapolis in the U.S. to meet a Dr. Janice Ophoven, one of the world's leading experts on serial killing mothers. She had worked on 30 or 40 cases of children who had been killed by serial killing mothers, and Ryan had sent her material about the Folbigg case. He also took with him microscopic slides and some tissue samples for her to look at. So Ophoven was briefed to examine the 4 deaths individually and as a whole. He learned that more young children in developed countries die from trauma than from any other disease, and the number 1 killer of babies less than a year is their mothers. So Dr. Ophoven thought each of the Folbigg children had been murdered. In her report, she wrote that the 4 Folbigg children were all the victims of homicidal assaults that resulted in their suffocation. The process of suffocation takes, 4 or 5 minutes?
Yeah, somewhere.
Well, during the first 1.5 to 2 minutes, while they're still fully conscious, children will fight aggressively for their lives. And in small infants, of course, this typically doesn't result in any physical evidence. They can't do a lot to protect themselves.
No.
But facts that led to her conclusion of homicidal suffocation included that the autopsy failed to identify any natural disease or disease process to explain the sudden deaths of the infants. All 4 children were growing and developing normally for their age and circumstances, and despite Patrick's handicaps, he had been doing well and really making some advances.
Well, I'm probably progressing. If he has cortical blindness and seizures, he's going to have some developmental delays.
Well, sure, but I think what they're saying is it shouldn't have caused him to just die all of a sudden.
Right, I'll buy that.
Yeah. But the autopsy findings were all consistent with death by suffocation. The infants were all in the care of the same person at the time of their death, their mother, and she was the last person to see each of them alive, so None of the deaths in this case could be attributed to SIDS, in her opinion.
Yeah, so she briefed the detective on the history of SIDS and the findings in 1972 of a doctor who had taken over the entire SIDS movement and sent it in the wrong direction for over 20 years. So if Detective Ryan had begun his investigation just 5 years earlier, medical experts would have told him that it was perfectly normal for several children to die from SIDS within one family. He would have been directed to the research conducted in 1972 by American Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, who indicated that SIDS was linked to apnea in babies and somehow ran in families. He changed the way the world saw SIDS with the publication in the October 72 edition in the American Journal of Pediatrics, and he studied 5 children.
5, that's it, for
Just
the whole
5.
group, yeah.
2 of the children had suffered from apnea and died despite the use of monitors. Their mother explained to the doctor that she had not heard the alarm on the monitor with her first child because she'd been in the bathroom with the door closed. And with the other child, she said that the monitor had been unplugged from the machine. So for over 20 years, this tiny study was used to show that SIDS was linked to apnea and it ran in families, which is not true.
No, big problems.
Certainly there were problems. So Dallas pathologist Dr. Linda Norton said that the paper had allowed homicides to continue. We don't know how many children would still be alive if it weren't for that paper.
Yeah, so that's stunning.
That's pretty damning.
It sure is. Well, when he got back to Australia, Detective Ryan took Kathleen's diary and had it analyzed at the Australian Bureau of Criminal Intelligence. Ryan knew there wasn't going to be a confession in the case, because at this time Kathleen and Craig had reunited. What he read in Kathleen's diary, though, convinced him completely of her guilt. Undercover police officers put the Folbigg house under surveillance. A police technician broke into the house and put in bugs without being caught. Tapes were made of every conversation in the house in July and August of 1999. Then Kathleen was interviewed at the police station for over 8 hours. The detectives had her read and explain her diary entries. For the most part, she said that she was blaming herself for having harsh feelings or for raising her voice to her babies, and that's all she had meant. She denied killing any of them. Then Kathleen and Craig broke up for good in 2000. Craig felt Kathleen was too domineering. She berated him because he was still grieving over their children, and Kathleen felt that he just couldn't move on. Once Detective Ryan had decided to arrest Kathleen, he knew he would need Craig to tell him the truth after he had been protecting Kathleen when they got back together. So what Ryan did is he arrested Craig for hindering an investigation. And at the police station, Craig was interviewed and they recorded this. And this time, Craig didn't try and protect Kathleen, and he told the truth. That same afternoon, Detective Ryan and other officers drove to Kathleen's new home and arrested her, and she was charged with the murder of Caleb, Patrick, Sarah, and Laura. Kathleen pleaded not guilty, and she was denied bail, but then in May she was released on $8,000 bond. Her trial began in April 2003, and it was pretty lengthy. It lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution's case argued that she had smothered all 4 of her children when she was frustrated and angry with them. Their case relied quite a bit on the improbability of all 4 of her children dying of natural causes and on the entries in Kathleen's diaries, and people supporting Kathleen would be very critical of that. Her diary entries were used to convict her of her children's murders. Passages included, "I feel like the worst mother on earth. I'm scared she'll leave me now like Sarah did. And I knew I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her. She left with a bit of help." So that one they really put a lot of weight on. Kathleen insisted that these diaries, though, were not an admission of a crime, but just the thoughts of an insecure mother who blamed herself for anything that went wrong in her life. Many people were really critical of this as well, because the prosecution was trying to use her father's criminal history and her early childhood traumas and losses as indicators of why she was a violent person. That seemed to be stretching things a bit. I can kind of agree with that. Can we really hold what her father did against her in a trial?
I don't know. I just imagine that if this was a case on trial in the United States, they wouldn't be allowed to present that as evidence.
Yeah, I would wonder if her attorneys maybe made a mistake in not trying to get that stopped. Statistical likelihoods, too, were presented as evidence by the prosecution. But then Kathleen's defense argued that all 4 children had died of natural causes. But the trial didn't go well for Kathleen. The jury of 6 men and 6 women found her guilty of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter and 1 count of maliciously inflicting grievous bodily harm. So she was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with 30 years being served before she'd be eligible for parole. In 2005, the court reduced Kathleen's sentence to 30 years on appeal, and she lives in protective custody, but she was badly beaten once in January 2021, not that long ago, after she was transferred from one prison to another. So an inquiry into her convictions in 2019 resulted in a 500-plus page report that failed to find any reasonable doubt as to Kathleen's guilt. Then on March 4th of this year, evidence was submitted to the court by 90 quite prominent scientists who believed Kathleen should be pardoned. Genetic evidence that was published in 2020 revealed that Kathleen's 2 girls had genetic mutations that predisposed them to heart conditions that wouldn't have been seen on autopsy. And the boys each carried 2 potentially lethal genetic mutations in the gene BSN, which has been linked to lethal epilepsy in mice. So I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that and explain it. It's a little complicated.
This is a tall order. Okay, I think the boys that had the potentially lethal genetic mutations, that would be a little easier to discuss, since the one boy never had any epilepsy, and the seizures that were seen in the other child were due to oxygen deprivation and not because of a mutant gene. So I don't know that that holds water too much.
Well, and if they only have proof that it does that to mice, that's...
Right. We don't have enough.
Yeah.
Now, I think the mutation of the girls, this is much more interesting. So what they found, well, I'll back up a little. We all have a protein in our bodies called calmodulin, which stands for calcium modulated protein. And this is a protein that's involved in signaling pathways in the body. So it has a function in inflammation, cell death, smooth muscle contraction, immune response. I mean, there's a lot of functions that this gene helps modulate. Now, there's different varieties of calmodulin. And what they found was that the mother, Kathleen, and both daughters had a mutation in the calmodulin 2 gene. And this variation, this mutation is linked to cardiac arrhythmias and sudden death. So
well, that is interesting.
That's fascinating. So it's associated, this genetic mutation, with the long QT syndrome, which we've talked about in some other cases, and something called catecholaminergic polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. Fortunately, it's abbreviated CPVT. And this is associated with severe arrhythmia that can lead to death. So if we talk about this, if I'm the defense and I'm trying to find alternative reasons for the girls to have died, this is perfect. I've got an explanation. They had this disorder that predisposed them to fatal cardiac arrhythmias, which you wouldn't know about until it happens.
Right, but you said Kathleen had the same thing.
Yeah, so...
And she's in her 50s and going strong.
So she's never had any cardiac manifestations that we know of. Right?
No.
The other thing, even if I explain it for the girls, what about the 2 boys? I mean, somehow all 4 of these kids died. So my thinking is that if I simply look at the 2 girls, I have enough to warrant not finding her guilty. But if I look at the whole picture, 2 boys, 2 girls, I still would consider her probably guilty.
Well, and I think that's the crux of her whole situation at trial, because the defense tried to get each case tried separately, where they wouldn't be allowed to talk about the other 3. And I think she would have had a pretty good chance of being found not guilty if the jury didn't know that this had happened 4 times.
Sure.
So the fact that it happened 4 times is a big part of her being convicted. Maybe the biggest part.
Yeah, I would think so.
Now, there are some other people who have had this happen, but the only ones that I've found in my research, even though they were found not guilty, seem guilty to me. So my opinion has been that Kathleen is guilty.
Yes.
So the appeal was rejected on March 24th. So the judge as well didn't find that to be enough for reasonable doubt. So the soonest Kathleen can be released is in 2028. So our sources for today I'm going to put in my show notes instead of reading them to you because there were multiple. I might just be doing that from now on anyway.
Yeah, you should.
There are also a couple of videos that I'll mention that were on YouTube, a 60 Minutes Australia and an Australian Story, which are great shows. We've listened to many of those on various Australian crimes. But TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel, and if you have comments, a case suggestion, or a beer recommendation, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or you can leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking on Send a Voicemail, or by looking in the show notes and clicking on the link that I will leave there. What do we have for feedback today, Dickie?
Today's feedback, we have a couple voicemails and a email.
So our first voicemail is from Gavin.
Hi Jill and Dick, my name is Gavin and I live near Geelong, Australia, and I really enjoy True Crime Brewery. I'd like to suggest 2 cases from Australia. My first recommendation is the murder of Joe Cinque by his law student girlfriend. That's spelled Cinque. I really recommend Helen Garner's book in this, her work in general. She's compassionate and reflective, and she builds relationships with the people most affected. She covers this case in Joe Cinque's Consolation. My second recommendation is the murder of Beth Barnard. This is an incredible story, or incredibly case of a violent but unsolved murder allegedly committed by a woman who has completely disappeared. The case is covered by Vicky Petratus in her book, The Phillip Island Murder. She's followed up more recently with the Vanishing of Vivian Cameron's podcast, and there's a case file episode on this as well, which is good. Both these cases have so many dimensions and invite a lot of discussion. So I'd really like to hear your take on them. And also for Dick, I used to be a craft brewer for 10 years.
Wow.
And I really dig your beer selections and reviews. And so thanks for the show. It's great. Keep it up.
Thanks, Gavin. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, these are a couple interesting cases. The first one, Joe Cinque, a little more straightforward, although why his law student girlfriend did this remains to be seen, but she allegedly laced his coffee with Rohypnol and then gave him a fatal injection of heroin. Nasty.
Maybe she was mad at him or something.
I guess she was. The other one, and I think we'll need to wait a little bit because I want to investigate this podcast that's coming up, but the Beth Barnard murder, this is 30-some years old, 1986. This woman had been having an affair with her boss, and she was killed. The boss's wife disappeared shortly after the murder and has never been seen again. So this case, as Gavin suggested or stated, the case has been treated as a murder-suicide. But this new podcast that's coming out questions that assertion.
Oh,
so
that's fascinating.
I think we ought to check into that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
My first thought was that the husband did something to both of them.
Yeah, you just have such a suspicious mind.
Yeah, I know.
But that would be an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, we'll have to look for that. He didn't say the name of the podcast?
He did. It's somewhere in there.
Okay. It shows how good we listen.
Yeah. Well, we didn't listen to it
all right.
carefully enough. And he's a craft brewer, or has been.
Yeah. Pretty cool.
And he didn't dump on me for reviewing Foster's as one of my beers from Australia. So.
Well, that was 5 years ago.
I like that.
I think they've let that go.
I hope.
Okay. We have another voicemail from Linda and Dave, a couple.
Yeah. Now, I've been told by Linda, because she also sent an accompanying email, that they had been drinking a little bit when they did this voicemail.
Oh, that'll be fun.
So she just wanted to kind of warn us of that.
All right. I can't wait.
Don't start it again. We already did it.
Hi, Dick and Jill. It's Linda and Dave Scott.
Hello.
We just recorded a message, but kind of got a message back that it didn't go through. So wanted to continue with this. if you remember, several months ago, I mentioned the Suzanne Morphew disappearance case. I'm in Colorado, and she lived in Salida, Colorado, which is in very much close proximity to where I live. Went out for a bike ride, supposedly on Mother's Day, and never returned. So I'm just following up with the story because today, or yesterday, her husband, Barry Morphew, was arrested for capital murder, concealing evidence, and
Other charges.
and trying to persuade a local official to not pursue this. So I think my estimation that he has something to do with it was very real. Wanted to also let you know that we were doing my husband here, Dave, is with me.
Hi, guys.
And we received a free trial beer from our local liquor store. Thank you very much. It's called Conflux, and it's from Draft Mead, MEAD, in Colorado Springs. And so we did open it up. We put it into the snifter, and we took a drink of it. It's
Very good.
It's very sweet. It has almost like a apple cider. It's almost like a cider beer.
So good.
David loves it. I'm not sure I do. I kind of like the hoppy stuff. So anyway, I listen to you every single day. On my way to work, on my way home. I love you both. I appreciate you both and your personalities and the information and the homework.
Oops.
That's
They
where
ran out of time.
They ran. The 3 minutes were up. But
that's hilarious.
I was listening to that, and I just thought, this is how we would sound.
Absolutely.
If we were giving a voicemail somewhere after we've had a couple beers.
I was going to say, they sound like they're at the quiet end.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
We're sitting with them discussing this case, and that's where we're at.
All right.
So that was good.
Very good.
The drink they had, I suspect, since it came from a meadery, that it's a mead.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a fermented honey drink. So I think that's why it was so sweet and had that appley cider type of taste.
Well, yeah, but Dave liked it.
Yeah, well, if you like it.
Linda wasn't sure, but Dave liked it.
Dave liked it, so we'll go with that.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
And then we got a case suggestion from Donna.
All right, this is an email from Donna, and she writes, "Hi, my suggestion for a podcast is the story of Rosemarie and Yazid Essa. This case has a doctor husband who poisons his wife by putting cyanide in his wife's calcium pills. Boy, that's really mean, isn't it?
You didn't think your pills tasted funny this morning?
No, we all need our calcium, and then he's going to do that? Not nice. This case has everything from infidelity, fleeing the country with the help of his brother and a seedy character from Lebanon, to finally getting extricated back to the state of Ohio to face justice for Rosie. Rosie's family is also a pretty amazing and interesting family, and they're determined to see that justice is done and making sure that Rosie and Yaz's 2 children are taken care of. I watched this trial on court TV back in the day, and it has stuck with me. Would love to see you do a podcast on this case." Well, thanks, Donna. That sounds like a solid recommendation.
Yeah, we always like to hear about spouses murdering each other.
That's just our thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much for listening, and thank you for your feedback. We just love feedback. The more the better, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. We'll see you next time at the quiet end.
We'll be sitting down there.
Yep. We'll keep them warm. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.